Folks, I am tremendously excited about this next segment. This is Caleb. I'm so glad that you've joined me. Would love to visit with you regarding a potential upcoming interview, and I want to get right down to it. I'd like to go through the introduction of the following book. Fascinating book, and the reason why I want to go through it offline here is that you know that this will be applicable to many of those that I've been doing recently. This is We the Corporations by Adam Winkler. It is a hot book out there, folks. I just want to go through the introduction today because that's something I will not be able to go through if, in fact, the interview with Mr. Winkler goes through. Would love to just educate you folks on the capacity for this book to really clarify some of those things that I've been bringing to your attention in the past weeks regarding corporations and how they evolved through Rome and through England. Uh, with no further ado, I will be reading the introduction to We the Corporations: How American Businesses Won Their Civil Rights by Adam Winkler. In December 1882, Roscoe Conkling, a former senator and close confidant of President Chester Arthur, appeared before the justices of the Supreme Court of the United States to argue that corporations like his client, the Southern Pacific Railroad Company, were entitled to equal rights under the 14th Amendment, although that provision of the Constitution said that no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, or deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of laws. Conkling insisted the amendment's drafters intended to cover business corporations too. Laws that referred to persons have by long and constant acceptance been held to embrace artificial persons as well as natural persons, Conkling explained. This long-standing practice was well known to the men who framed the Congress, which proposed, and the people who, through their legislatures, ratified the 14th Amendment. Conkling's claim was remarkable. The 14th Amendment had been adopted after the Civil War to guarantee the rights of freed slaves, not to protect corporations. Conkling, however, had unusual credibility with the justices. For 2 decades, he had been the leader of the Republican Party in Congress and was often said to be the most powerful man in Washington. He had twice been nominated to the Supreme Court himself. Most recently, in the spring of the same year, he appeared on behalf of the Southern Pacific Railroad. The Senate voted to confirm him, but he declined the position, citing poverty from his career in public service, becoming the last person to turn down a Supreme Court uh, after having been confirmed. More than most lawyers, then, Conkling was considered by the justices to be their peer, and when it came to the history surrounding the drafting of the 14th Amendment, Conkling's expertise was unparalleled. As a member of Congress during Reconstruction, Conkling had been on the very committee that wrote the amendment. If anyone could testify to the intent of the 14th Amendment's drafters, it was Conkling, who was one himself. To back up his improbable story, Conklin produced a musty, never before published journal that purported to detail his committee's deliberations. A close look at the journal, Conklin suggested, would show that while the nation was focused on the rights of the freedman, he and the other members of Congress had also been worried about the laws that unduly burdened businesses. It was for this very reason that 14th Amendment used the word person. An early draft of the amendment had guaranteed the rights of citizens. Conkling said, but the language was later changed specifically to include corporations, which were often deemed by the law to be persons for various purposes. As a result, Conkling argued that the 14th Amendment guaranteed the Southern Pacific Railroad the same rights of equal protection and due process as the former slaves. There was just one small problem with Conkling's account of the drafting of the 14th Amendment. It was not true. The drafters of the 14th Amendment did not try to secret into Constitution broad new protections for corporations, nor was the wording of the amendment ever altered in the way Conkling suggested. As we will see, one of the preeminent figures in American politics had attempted to deceive the justices of the Supreme Court in an effort to win constitutional protections for the Southern Pacific Railroad. Although a procedural snafu prevented the Supreme Court from issuing a final ruling in Conkling's case, the justices soon after embraced Conkling's argument that corporations had rights protected by the 14th Amendment. In the years that followed, the Supreme Court would invoke those corporate rights to invalidate numerous laws governing how businesses were to be run, supervised, and taxed. Between 1868, when the amendment was ratified, and 1912, when a scholar set out to identify every 14th Amendment case heard by the Supreme Court, and the justices decided 28 cases dealing with the rights of African Americans, and an astonishing 312 cases dealing with the rights of corporations. At the same time, the court was upholding Jim Crow laws in infamous cases like Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896. The justices were invalidating minimum wage laws, curtailing collective bargaining efforts, voiding manufacturing restrictions, and even overturning a law regulating the weight of commercial loaves of bread. The 14th Amendment, adopted to shield the former slaves from discrimination, had been transformed into a sword used by corporations to strike at unwanted regulation. We the people, revered by so many, those three words that begin the Constitution, have also been criticized for being inaccurate. When the Constitution went into effect in 1789, African Americans were enslaved in 11 states, and women were not allowed to vote in any of them. The framers used the phrase "we the people" to identify who was responsible for enacting this character of liberty and self-government, but their description was misleading. More than half the nation's population was prohibited from participating in the process by which the Constitution was adopted. Most were also denied many of the rights the Constitution purported to guarantee. For those left out, the phrase was not a description but an aspiration, and American history has often pivoted around their struggles to gain equal rights, their fight to finally take their rightful place among we the people. While the civil rights movements for women, radical minorities, and other oppressed groups have been thoroughly studied, there has been another centuries-long push for equal rights that has remained largely, new book, untouched: the corporate rights movement. Roscoe Conkling's case was neither the first nor the last corporations asked the Supreme Court to recognize their constitutional rights. Despite the fact that corporations have never been subjected to systematic oppression like women and minorities, they too have pushed to gain constitutional protections since America's earliest days. Indeed, today corporations have nearly all the same rights as individuals: freedom of speech, freedom of the press, religious liberty, due process, equal protection, freedom from unreasonable searches and seizures, the right to counsel, the right against double jeopardy, and the right to trial by jury, among others. Corporations do not have every right guaranteed by the Constitution. They have no right to vote or right against self-incrimination, and none to date has gone to court asserting a right to keep and bear arms. Yet corporations have won a considerable share of the Constitution's most fundamental protections. Corporations, too, have fought to become part of we the people. In the past decade of constitutional rights for corporations was thrust into the public spotlight by the Supreme Court's controversial 2010 decision in Citizens United. By a narrow 5-4 majority, the justices ruled that corporations have a First Amendment right to spend their money to influence elections. The decision was widely unpopular, with polls showing an overwhelming majority of both Democrats and Republicans opposed. Citizens United also helped inspire Occupy Wall Street, where protesters carried signs declaring corporations are not people. "I don't care how many times you try to explain it," President Barack Obama said. "Corporations aren't people, people are people." As of 2016, 16 states and hundreds of municipalities had endorsed a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United and clarify that constitutional rights belong to human beings, not corporations. The backlash has little effect on the justices. 4 years after Citizens United, the Supreme Court expanded the rights of corporations once again in Hobby Lobby case. The court held that Hobby Lobby stores, a chain of craft stores with 23,000 employees and over $3 billion in annual revenue, had religious liberty rights under a federal statute. The company, which was founded by a religious family and remains closely held, was allowed an exemption from a federal rule requiring large employers to include birth control in their employees' health plans. The Hobby Lobby decision has since been cited to support the claims of businesses whose owners do not wish to provide wedding services to same sex couples on grounds of religion. These Supreme Court decisions came as a surprise to many people, lawyers included. Law students are taught about civil rights, women's rights, Native American rights, gay rights, even states' rights, but not about corporate rights. Yet at the corporate transformation of the 14th Amendment, the wake of Conkling's deception suggests the Citizens United and Hobby Lobby decisions are just proverbial tip of the iceberg, the most visible manifestations of a larger and largely hidden phenomenon. Over the course of American history, corporations have pushed relentlessly and with noteworthy success to gain the same rights as individuals under the Constitution. Corporations did not win their constitutional rights in quite the same way as women, racial minorities, or gays and lesbians. Historians of those more familiar civil rights movements emphasize how activists pursued their claims in both courts of law and the court of public opinion. To achieve lasting constitutional change, scholars say, required more than judicial victories. Those movements also had to change public opinion. Lawsuits were backed up by broad-based popular social movements and demanded rights for those who had been denied the original promise of the we the people. Activists mobilized the masses and through protests, marches, and public advocacy persuaded not just judges but the larger society that these excluded groups deserved equal rights. According to one scholar, the Supreme Court usually pays attention in an actual or emerging moral consequence or moral consensus, certainly with respect to fundamental rights. Corporations, in contrast, gained their rights without winning over hearts and minds. Ronald McDonald and the Pillsbury Doughboy never marched on Washington or protested down Main Street with signs demanding equal rights for corporations. Corporations unquestionably benefited from popular mobilizations for states' rights, small government, and free markets. Yet there was never an effort to convince the public that corporations as such should have individual rights too. Corporate rights were won in courts of law by judicial rulings extending fundamental protections to business, even in the absence of any national consensus in favor of corporate rights. As Adolf Berle and Gardner Means, two especially influential thinkers about the corporation, once wrote, "It is the essence of revolutions of the more silent sort that they are unrecognized until they are far advanced." The corporate rights revolution was not exactly silent. In fact, the controversies that led to these important judicial rulings were often well publicized in their day. The larger pattern, however, remained hidden, at least until Citizens United. We the Corporations focuses on one central element of the corporate rights movement: how corporations pursued and won constitutional protections through the courts, especially the Supreme Court. Although Americans often think of the Supreme Court as a bulwark to protect minority rights against the tyranny of the majority, the court's record of protecting women and racial minorities was dishearteningly bad prior to the 1950s. For most of American history, the Supreme Court failed to protect the dispossessed and the marginalized, with justices claiming to be powerless in the face of hostile public sentiment. As we will see, however, the court's record on corporate rights was much different. In 1809, the Supreme Court decided the first case on constitutional rights of corporations, decades before the first comparable cases for women or racial minorities. And unlike women and minorities, who lost nearly all of their early cases, corporations won this first case and have compiled an impressive list of victories in the years since. For corporations, the court has insisted that the broad public sentiment favoring business regulation must bend to the demands of the Constitution. To the extent the Supreme Court is a bulwark against the tyranny of the majority, powerful and wealthy corporations have been among the primary beneficiaries. In our daily discourse, Supreme Court justices are often labeled as liberal or conservative. Yet, what has often united justices across the left and right spectrum is a tendency to side with businesses. In recent years, scholars have increasingly noticed that even in the ideologically divided Roberts Court, the justices regularly find common ground in business cases. This pattern, however, is not unique to the contemporary Supreme Court. For most of American history, the court has been decidedly favorable to businesses, regardless of whether the majority of justices was liberal or conservative. There are a number of ways this business tilt can be measured, from the number of cases business interests win to the adoption of legal rules that promote free enterprise. One prominent yet understudied illustration in the historic and self conscious expansion of constitutional rights for corporations. Corporate constitutional protections were not merely, however, a product of a business friendly Supreme Court. In many instances, corporations gained constitutional rights when their cases became tangled up in a larger political battles or jurisprudential developments. In the early 1800s, for example, the renowned Chief Justice John Marshall sought to protect corporate rights as a way of enhancing the power of the fledgling federal government. After the Civil War, Justice Stephen Field, undoubtedly the most colorful justice to sit on the nation's high court, he remains the only sitting justice ever arrested for murder, no less, saw corporate rights as necessary to stem the rising tide of socialism. As the Supreme Court embraced new, more libertarian understandings of free speech a century ago, the justices also extended First Amendment rights to newspaper corporations, without which the freedom of the press would be much less meaningful in a modern society. Indeed, the history of corporate rights sheds new light on and complicates our understanding of liberal and conservative. Supreme Court Chief Justice Roger Taney, the author of the infamous Dred Scott case, whose reactionary views on race have left him one of the most reviled figures in the history of the Supreme Court, was one of the most forceful advocates for limiting the constitutional rights of corporations. In the early 20th century, the Lochner case, which became notorious for its frequent rulings siding with business against government regulation, was also the first to articulate clear boundaries to corporate constitutional rights. Corporations were entitled to property rights, the Lochner case said, but not rights associated with personal property like free speech. Ironically, it was the famously liberal New Deal and Warren courts of the mid 20th century that first extended liberal rights to corporations. This long view also illuminates the nuanced role of corporate personhood in the story of corporate rights. Many critics of Citizens United believe that corporations have the same rights as individuals because the Supreme Court defines them as people. The proposed constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United is based on this idea, declaring that only human beings are people under the terms of the Constitution. Yet corporate personhood has played out a secondary role in the corporate rights movement. While the Supreme Court has on occasion said that corporations are people, the justices have more often relied upon a very different conception of the corporation, one that views it as an association capable of asserting the rights of its members. This alternative way of thinking about the corporation has paved the way for a steady expansion of corporate rights. Indeed, as we will see, corporate personhood has traditionally and surprisingly been used to justify limits on the rights of corporations. Corporations and the Constitution are more intimately linked than one might imagine. Our story will begin in the colonial era, when even before corporations sought individual rights in the Supreme Court, they nonetheless exerted considerable influence on American ideas of government. It was a corporation, after all, that planted the first seeds of democracy in the colonies, and the goal was to secure profit, not to promote liberty. Moreover, the framers built from what they knew, and the colonies had been originally organized as corporations, operating under written characters like the Constitution, set the rules for lawmaking and imposed limits on the power of office holders. As a result, numerous distinctive features of the American Constitution can trace their roots to the nation's corporate origins. After the Constitution was ratified, corporations quickly sought to gain the rights it guaranteed to individuals. Although there was never a broad based popular movement for corporate rights throughout American history, the nation's most popular corporations have persistently mobilized to use the Constitution to fight off unwanted government regulations. The Bank of the United States, the brainchild of Alexander Hamilton, and the first great American corporation, brought the first corporate rights case to the Supreme Court in 1809. The Southern Pacific Railroad. Bear with me, folks. Forgot to turn the phone off. Forgive me. Southern Pacific Railroad pushed to win rights of equal protection and due process in Roscoe Conkling's case. Tobacco companies sued to gain the Constitution's protections for criminal defendants, and the First National Bank fought to win political speech rights for corporations 3 decades before Citizens United. Standard Oil, Ford Motor Company, General Motors, the New York Times Company, and U.S. Steel all played roles in the story of corporate rights, along with insurance companies, brewing companies, mining companies, newspapers, and national chains. Political scientists have shown that large companies tend to be more politically active and show greater sophistication in their political activity than smaller firms, and the pursuit of corporate constitutional rights may be understood as another illustration of this phenomenon. Although the focus of this book is on business corporations, we will see that several of the Supreme Court's most important corporate rights cases involved other types of organizations that nonetheless took the corporate form. Dartmouth College, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and even Citizens United, non-profit profit advocacy group, were all corporations that fought to establish their own rights. Yet, because the Supreme Court has rarely differentiated among the various types of corporations, even those cases resulted in greater constitutional protections for businesses. Corporations have a straightforward motivation to seek constitutional rights to fight laws and regulations that restrict business autonomy and interfere with the pursuit of profit. The profit motive has long made corporations formidable political actors who exert a strong influence on lawmaking, and indeed, the vast majority of lobbyists in Washington work for companies and business oriented trade associations. Yet, as the story of corporate constitutional rights reminds us, business influence is not restricted to the elected branches. Corporate interests have also exerted themselves aggressively in the courts of law, using the Constitution to expand their power. When popular pressures have succeeded in winning laws to restrict corporations, be it in the name of consumers, investors, the environment, or the public at large, constitutional litigation has provided businesses with another chance to manipulate public policy to increase its own profits. Even if the companies lose in the end, the cost of litigation might still serve to discourage lawmakers from adopting future regulations. Corporations are all but compelled to seek constitutional rights by American corporate law, the body of legal rules that dictate how corporations are formed and managed. Corporations are required by long-standing corporate law principles to maximize profit for shareholders, at least in the long term. When government regulations impose significant costs on a corporation, this legal requirement directs companies to pursue any lawful, cost-effective means of reducing the cost of compliance. For corporations, filing lawsuits to establish their rights and overturn unwanted regulations is just another cost of doing business. In gaining the protection coverage of the Constitution, corporations have been assisted by the brightest, most able lawyers of the day. Just as the civil rights movement had Thurgood Marshall and the women's rights movement had Ruth Bader Ginsburg, corporate rights had Daniel Webster, widely considered the greatest advocate in the history of the Supreme Court, who argued 223 cases before the justices, many on behalf of the nation's largest corporations. Horace Binney, a young and creative lawyer who won the first corporate rights cases in the Supreme Court by employing an ingenious argument designed to hide the fact that a corporation was involved. And Theodore Olson, the lawyer who argued Citizens United, and the dean of an emergent school of Supreme Court specialists that bolstered the clout of businesses in the nation's highest tribunal. Even Thurgood Marshall argued for constitutional rights for corporations during the height of the civil rights era, when corporate rights became entangled with the issues of race. As Marshall's example suggests, the fight for corporate rights weaves through some of the most important controversies and turning points in American history. Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson's battle over the National Bank, the fight over slavery before the Civil War, the trust-busting crusades of Theodore Roosevelt and demagoguery of Huey Long, the Civil Rights Revolution, and the emergence of the Tea Party. The nature and growth of our corporate constitutional rights were shaped by those debates, and in turn, we will see those debates were influenced by the struggle for corporate rights. The history of corporate rights reveals that corporations are both adept constitutional leveragers and create constitutional first movers. As the constitutional leveragers, corporations have successfully exploited constitutional reforms originally designed for progressive causes, transforming them to serve the ends of capital. The 14th Amendment, for example, was designed to protect the rights of freed men, but Conkling and the Southern Pacific Railroad pushed the Supreme Court to use it to protect the rights of corporations. In the 1970s, Ralph Nader won a landmark case on behalf of consumers that established a First Amendment right to advertise, a right that corporations, including tobacco and gaming companies, used to overturn laws designed to help consumers. Yet corporations are also constitutional first movers, and historically have often been innovators at the cutting edge of constitutional litigation. They have not always piggybacked on the rights already held by individuals. In fact, numerous individual rights Americans hold dear today were first secured in lawsuits involving corporations. Businesses often have an unusual appetite for pursuing novel and risky legal claims. Stirred by the desire to increase profits and untangle themselves from regulation, they also often have resources to justify the costs of litigation. As a result, the earliest Supreme Court cases to strike down laws for violating the First Amendment, for example, were spearheaded by corporations, as were some of the earliest search and seizure cases under the 14th Amendment. Corporations were behind the preponderance of early cases that breathed life into the equal protection and due process guarantees of the 14th Amendment rights that in subsequent years became the basis for Brown v. Board of Education, outlawing racial segregation in schools, Roe v. Wade, guaranteeing the right to choose abortion, and Obergefell versus Hodges, recognizing the right to same-sex marriage. It is not fanciful to say that on more than one occasion corporations have been among the unsung heroes of civil rights. To say that corporations have had a civil rights movement of their own should not trivialize the historic struggles for racial minorities, women, the LGBT community, and others to gain equal citizenship. The people involved in those fights for constitutional protections overcame violence and terror to establish their rights, and some lost their lives in the effort. There is no moral equivalency between the civil rights women's movement and gay rights movement on the one hand and the corporate rights movement on the other, nor should the recounting of the history of corporate rights be taken as an endorsement of broad protections for corporations, or for that matter as an attack on corporate rights. The goal here is simply to show how corporations have pursued a long-standing strategic effort to establish and expand their constitutional protections, often employing many of the same strategies as other well-known movements: civil disobedience, test cases, and the pursuit of innovative legal claims in a purposeful effort to reshape the law. For better or worse, the corporate rights movement, like its more famous cousins, has also transformed America. We the Corporations uncovers the lost history of the corporate rights movement and tells the dramatic, surprising, and even shocking stories behind the landmark Supreme Court cases that extended the Constitution's most fundamental protections to corporations. Now, I'm going to stop there, and we're stopping right before part one, corporate origins. And this book is fascinating, folks, because this is the history that we're not told, and this is the information that we need to place together certain items in our understanding in our history. Because if we're talking about landmark Supreme Court cases in 1809, well, we've already done the historic search back to that time frame. We're talking about, just before 1812, the Battle of 1812, when the British came and burned all our documents in Washington, D.C. To imagine that we had major corporate legislation happening 3 years before then is rather coincidental. In my hopes, I've already had Mr. Winkler accept an invite for interview on Patriot Soapbox on Powerful Words with Caleb. This is a review of the introduction of his book, which is a barn burner, We the Corporations, How American Businesses Won Their Civil Rights, by Adam Winkler. You can find this. This is an award-winning book, as is his previous book that we will be chatting about briefly, which is Gunfight, which Adam is one of the clearly one of the greatest proponents and straight down the middle reviewers of the Second Amendment and the viability of the Second Amendment in the United States. And he's a professor at UCLA Law School, and obviously one of the most notable experts on these areas of legal matters. I really do appreciate your time, and I thank you for showing up. Hopefully, this introduction has been effective in raising our awareness to the fact that behind the scenes, throughout our U.S. history, corporations have had the money, the time, the desire, and the reasoning to assign themselves through the courts and argue their need for civil rights, the same civil rights that we have. I really do appreciate your time, and I love you, and have a wonderful day.